Good afternoon, everybody who's watching this on YouTube, and good afternoon to you, Professor Shome, for accepting our invitation to have a conversation about taxation from Mughal India to modern India. So, SenseMaker is a space where we have seminar-like conversation with experts in the field, and because your expertise in taxation is beyond geographies, so we also wanted to have a larger temporal conversation. You wrote a very interesting book, and recently in 2021, which is a historical account, but also a theoretical account of taxation in the world. It came just as COVID-19 led lockdowns in 2020 were intensifying all across the world. But in the introduction of the book, you make a very interesting point. And the point is that a lot of examples that were given to you when you were a student were from a Western point of view, and you wanted to set the record straight with some examples from the East. And in that context, you wrote a very interesting chapter. The first couple of chapters were very interesting when it comes to different things that were being done in India. But the chapters on Mughals was very short, crisp, and also very, very interesting. You kind of talk about two most important contenders for the Mughal prestige. One, the Emperor Akbar, and then Emperor Aurangzeb. You pointed out and contrasted how the taxation system under them blossomed and then led to an eventual decline. While I was reading the chapter, I had this one question which popped up, and which we were having the initial conversation about the SenseMaker conversation right now. I asked you, how was it that the Mughal administration managed to create an empire during all the wars that they were doing, but they also managed to create a taxation system which kept pace with the empire building, and a series of different disasters which overtook the Mughal empire, be it floods, be it droughts. How were they able to create this taxation system?
Thank you. I think both are kind of interesting questions. First, we must realize that Akbar, both of them, Akbar and Aurangzeb, reigned for about 50 years, half a century. So they had time, apart from expansion of their realm, they had time for administration, improvements, and consolidation if they wished to. And both of them did. Akbar was the first one to really modernize administration, and it took him about 20 years to really redefine some of the measurements, like the measurement of the bigha of land, and on the basis of which the tax was assessed, and similarly the quality of land on which different crops were assessed. So he could variegate the tax structure with different rates reflecting the quality of land, the arability of land, and the types of crops. At the same time, the expansion of his realm took place a little bit differently from Aurangzeb. Akbar kind of used the instrument of cooperation and threats, that is, carrot and stick. So he could first go and offer an olive branch to join him. And if not, as we know in certain parts of Rajasthan and so on, there were wars. And while the Rajputs were extraordinarily brave and courageous, but one by one, many of them, even through matrimonial relationships and so on, they acceded to Akbar. So Akbar at one point reigned in the northwest, from the northwest frontier of provinces area to Gujarat in the south, and in the southern, even though it was west, and to almost Bengal in the east. So it was a huge realm that he managed, and at the same time keeping the administration in mind. And Aurangzeb, his great grandson, I think, yes, he uh, was a different kind of person. Without going into the history of all of it, while Akbar abolished the jizya, which was a tax on non Muslims. It was a progressive tax, which Akbar abolished because he was very uncomfortable with religious differences and administration utilizing them. Aurangzeb actually reimposed it. And so Aurangzeb's approach was quite different. But at the same time, during famine or floods and so on, he sent out diktats for the Jagirdars and the Chaudharis and so on not to break the law and to actually implement the rebates that had been granted by the court to for the destitute farmers and so on. That was not easy to implement, but Aurangzeb administration did take measures to alleviate conditions of that kind. So, at the same time, his expansion of the realm was through war in which he himself participated a lot. So, he wanted to expand it into the Deccan. And as he went to the Deccan, that was probably a bit his nemesis. And his son, another Akbar, rebelled, and so actually Aurangzeb fled to Persia for some time, but then returned and so on. So he was a very warlike person, without, however, forgetting or completely ignoring the administration of Israel. So both of them managed to introduce administrations which was basically on land, but also indirect taxation of certain excisable items, which were quite progressive in rates and quite expansive, and took care or recognized the quality and quantity and irrigability of land and so on. And at the same time, they expanded their realms quite phenomenally. That's the story.
Thank you, Professor. I think in the book you make a very interesting observation about the tax collection under Akbar was more efficient than under Aurangzeb, the point that you just made. But then also that the way some of these taxes were collected, there was still a lot of inefficiencies. Moving away from this, when you are concluding this particular chapter in the book, you talk about the Jagat Seths. And the Jagat Seths become very important because they play a very important role in, let's say, the evolution of the British East India trading. Now, there's a lot to unpack in the way the English taxed, and there's a lot that we could go into. But there's one specific thing that I would want to understand from you. And the first is, tell us a bit about salt tax, because this is a tax which goes against the grain from just about every point and is a very inhumane kind of a tax. But tell us how the tax was introduced and how the tax was collected. The huge wall that they had made for the collection of this tax. And was this tax really profitable in the long run?
Yeah. Actually, the salt tax had existed. What happened during the British rule was the way it was administered and the draconian punishments that were imposed, and the rapid rise in the progressivity and the rate structure of the salt tax. That is what made it very unbearable. It was actually a tax which was based on a weight measure and so many paise per measure. However, that was only when the tax was collected. But in an environment where tax was produced along the sea belt and the lake districts of the country, and the producers then traded and sent it to the interior areas and hinterlands, which was a well established method, and the rates were all determined and a well functioning system. The British saw that this could be harnessed even more, and they actually said that manufacturing of salt was completely forbidden by the private sector. So they took over the monopoly of production, and even picking up salt from the sea, salt beds and so on, became forbidden, and with a punishment of 6 months jail, which was actually imposed. And uh, and the tax rates went on becoming higher and higher, to the extent that the original salt producing areas had to become salt importers from Britain. And that is the point to be noted, how exporters, in not just in this, but in textile and yarn and so on and so forth, but in salt, that is what happened. And the price of salt increased to such an extent that it was even very difficult for importers to import and trade in them, and then to be able to sell it to the general public. But as far as the British were concerned, it appeared to be a very good source, and different British administrators reported to Parliament that these taxes, despite the dire conditions, we are able to increase revenue and so on, and Parliament never questioned it for a long time. Then, of course, there were certain members of Parliament, few and far between, who began to question it, and then in the 20th century, early 20th century, the media in Britain got hold of it and began to question it. But because it was so forbidden, because it was so out of reach of Indian manufacturers and distributors, Gandhi thought that this is a good instrument for protests. So he then organized a march from Sabarmati, his ashram, to Dundee on the coast, and went and picked up a handful of salt. The picking up itself was such an act that its impact was electric. People, and he just went with 67, 69 people on the march, and it took him 3 to 4 days. And on the eastern side in Midnapur, uh, 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 another Congress leader called Das, and Das led about 1,000 people to do the same, and on the same day. So it was both west and east that salt was used as an instrument, and immediately the rest of India, domestic India, began to make salt at home. And as they did it, the police began to refuse to fire into the ordinary human beings who were breaking the salt law. And so Gandhi actually thought of it, and many of these instruments were very unique to Gandhi, but many younger Congress leaders bought this. Some other senior Congress leaders thought these were rather idiosyncratic, and they never understood Gandhi, but they kind of followed whatever he finally did, because such was the strength of his personality. But of course, Subhash Chandra Bose ultimately didn't quite and broke away, but most people didn't, including Sardar Patel, including Nehru, who had great difficulties in agreement, had disagreements in the early years with Gandhi, but they eventually fell into line, but not Subhash Chandra Bose. He took a different route. So the British eventually were arresting 100,000 people for the salt tax protests, and the salt marches were going on all over India, and they saw that this was untenable. Even after the salt marches and so on and so forth, the British actually increased the salt tax rates, got huge amounts of revenue, much to the satisfaction of Winston Churchill, and but many investigators, British investigators, have said that whatever was, the post-mortem, whatever was happening with the salt tax, actually, we must agree that unquestionably the salt tax was the last nail on the coffin of British Raj. So this is how the salt tax panned out. And it basically brought to the attention of the US and UK public, and through their media, what was happening in India as a whole. Salt, rather than just salt tax, the coverage in print media, on newsreels, you name it, was so wide that everyone, suddenly India became important. That is the role that the salt tax marches and Gandhi's superior intelligent step had on the independence movement. Of course, there were so many others. Just to mention, Gandhiji is not at all adequate or fair. So many others, so many gave their lives. I mean, in intrinsic ways. Similarly, Subhash Chandra Bose's departure and Vallabhbhai Patel's ability to get the whole country together, as a union. The Bhimraj, your Ambedkar's brilliant writing of the Constitution, and so the contributions are endless. However, Gandhi just stand out in the political, intelligence of it all.
As the chief strategist and the ideologue of the freedom movement, perhaps Mahatma Gandhi had no parallel. But of course, everybody was important. And this brings me to the discussion we were just having before we started. A country, as you just said, that got and put the spotlight back on England for the salt tax that they were levying on people, the most common ingredient that you need to cook anything, and it was being taxed very heavily. So you would imagine that the first act that the independent India would do would be to abolish the said salt tax. But we have in 1953 the government led by the first Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru, coming up with the salt, and this kind of brings it all together. The on the one hand, the nuance, understanding of the impact that it has, but on the other hand, the larger bureaucracy misreading the tax repercussions on the larger people. So I would just like your comment on how does the modern Indian state, and if there is one criticism that has been universal of the modern Indian state, is its ability to tax and overtax, sometimes killing the golden goose. So do you see in it, with this, the beginning of the, say, I don't want to use the oft cited word, but let's say zealous taxation?
Yeah. In fact, I would say overzealous taxation. But the thing is that you're quite right that our income tax code was written in 1961. It was implemented from 1962. But in terms of the excises, through the constitution, the excises on individual commodities that came to the powers of the center, while the sales base that went to the states. So right from the beginning, the states were in charge of the sales tax on any sales. But before that itself, before the sales, of course, the production took place of manufacturing, and at that level, the center collected the tax. So in that excisable long list of things, of products, came your salt, sugar, tobacco, other spirits, and then later on luxury items like automobiles, yachts, Fords, and so on and so on. But over and above that, the excise rates were very variegated, and became more and more complex. Now, why continue with it? Because the salt tax was always a very easy to collect item, as you said, an item of everyday consumption. And for even under the Mughals, it was collected. And even under the French, not just in their colonies, but in France itself, the salt tax had played a role. And so it was not an unknown tax. The issue under the Mughals was that it was never raised as an issue because the structure and collection were I suppose, acceptable. I mean, people suffered anyway because of the taxes. But in the case of the draconian administration, implementation, and almost a kind of frolicsome change and extraction by the British, that drew the attention and it became unbearable. So the after independence, the continuation of the salt cess it was not a tax. A cess is a kind of an additional small item that was collected, and in all of the cesses, the original objective was a particular development sector. So probably the salt was, for the development of the salt sector because people had suffered and so on. But eventually, those objectives were not kept. We have had several cesses, but when the eventual goods and services tax was structured in 2017, many of the cesses were kind of gobbled up into the GST base and were removed. But the salt was a common tax base as an excisable, so it just continued. And similarly, if you really look at the income tax and so on, there was a lot of reform in the first codes itself, but many features actually did continue from earlier on. So
And
similarly, the salt and alcohol and tobacco. But I quite agree. The while alcohol and tobacco are demerit, that and even sugar could be called a bit of a demerit good, but salt never was. And but still, the salt cess was there. I
right.
agree that that was kind of. I think that was a matter of convenience, and going back into history, they just cleaned up the administration of it.
So before we jump into the sort of your professional experiences, largely from 1980s in really helping countries to reassess how they collect taxes. But now I have a 40-year period that I have to bridge before I get into your professional career and things that you've done and you have thought about and written about. When we talk about decolonization, and as we speak and as we record this today on 9th of August 2024, 6 days from now, we have our Independence Day. And a lot of countries, they celebrate their Independence Day right around the same year and after that. One feature of decolonization was there was a lot of political angst against their uh, rulers who had just vacated, but a lot of these newly formed countries continue to have the same kind of taxation logic. A, primarily, as you just said, it was because it was easy to collect and you have a country to run, you have a government to run. So, how are you going to finance it? But there was not enough thought given to the way the taxation system was supposed to do certain things. For example, taxation at the end of the day is a mechanism for reducing inequality and also to increase the economic activity. From 1945, broadly the creation of the United Nations, to till the end of or beginning of the American Consensus in 1991, we have a 46-year period in which taxation kind of plays a villainous role. I would like your comment on that because these are, I mean, I know I'm asking you a very broad temporal question, but tell us how and what was going through different governments' mind and how taxation came to be this great object of social stratification, which ultimately failed in a lot of the places.
The one very kind of crucial reason why all governments fall back on taxation is not just to collect revenue, but also to keep a handle on the overall demand side of the economy. Because if there is too much excess demand, that is an impetus and a fillip to inflation. So India has always been extraordinarily conscious and fearful of high inflation because we have had a high proportion of the relatively poor. And statistics differ, but one can say even today I'm not talking about the poverty, the formal poverty count of 26% or 30% and so on. But how, do people feel poor? Yes, I would say half the population still feels poor. And for them, inflation is a catastrophic uh, kind of outcome for their daily lives. The government has always been cognizant of that and therefore has kept a tight control on government expenditure, uh, government deficits, and therefore, in order to control that, no, expenditures have to be met because of the relative poverty in the country, and therefore tax burden has to be high. Now, remember at one point in the 60s and 70s, the tax rates used to be above 70%, 75%, and the marginal rates. That was slashed slowly and very much so that the rates became in the 90s, I think, as low as 30, 20, 10, which are now, so you're saying the tax pressure, this thing, that was from that time, it has been one of the lowest tax structures for income tax among comparable emerging economies. In fact, now there is space and need in order to meet our expenditure needs, in order to comply with the UN goal of leaving no one behind and all that, we need more resources. So, however, the challenge, and you mentioned the Tax Administration Reform Commission, it's the longest report, I'm told, in Indian tax matters, in 6 volumes. One of the main things that we pointed out was how tax is administered, not so much the structure. Yes, if it is too draconian, the structure itself, there's a Laffer curve effect and so on and so forth. And whether the Laffer curve effect actually is there, it's never been proved statistically. But let's assume there's a Laffer curve, meaning if the rates are too high, then the tax collection actually falls. And but even though there's no proof of it, the fact remains that you cannot have tax rates that are so high that they provide lots of disincentives. But in India today, the tax rates are very low. And if you really look at the income tax incentives and the incentives from the corporate income tax, which thin out the tax base, and even the personal income tax, for example, if you own irrespective of the size of a property, you don't have that. You don't have a wealth tax. Inheritance tax is opposed. Now, in a country of our nature, with such inequality, and today, because of all these things, production, productivity, incomes, they should not be discouraged. But tax has to be paid on them. And today we have become the most unequal country in the world. The only other country that competes from time to time, one year it's a little higher, is Brazil. But there is no argument why among comparable countries we have now become most unequal. So I don't think there is tax terrorism in the overall tax structure. But there could be some tax terrorism in the way the tax is administered. There is a feeling that tax is administered unequally, meaning it is not an unequal structure, but the way it is administered. So the honest taxpayer must feel that I am being treated exactly the same way as another person next door. And then on top of that, you have the tax structure where some of the most wealthy and rich income earners, we are very proud of them, but their tax rates are among the lowest progressive rates in the world. So the two together, the tax terrorism sometimes felt by the middle class and the tax structure, which is so benign to the richest in the country, the two of them together combine and cut our tax collection adversely. As a result of this, the tax administrators also obviously feel frustrated because the tax structure is such that the rates are not very high. If you compare with any comparable, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Australia, all of them, they have higher final marginal rates. And I'm talking about the individual income tax now. And therefore, I think there's a lot of room for improvement in the inheritance tax, in the wealth tax, even the super rich tax on the wealth. Now, this government has a super rich rate, but that is not sufficient. That has to be integrated with the general income tax structure. We have to have a wealth tax for the super rich. We have not just the income tax, but the wealth tax. We have to have an inheritance tax for above a certain threshold. Other countries have it. Good administrative machinery now with the help of IT and very soon probably AI, because our country has all the resources for artificial intelligence and any type of computerization and so on. So I think that we have to think through these matters. And so the tax terrorism is a kind of a mirage. And that can be removed if we structure our rates and structure our administration appropriately.
Probably, so I was about to ask you a question that would have taken us to a global thing, but you made very interesting points from the India's point of view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you two questions, which because when I was preparing for this, it came up. First, in a reply to a parliamentary inquiry last year, the finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman, she stated that tax compliance in India has improved. And the figures that she mentioned, that there has been a compound annual growth rate of 3.4 for the number of people who are filing the income tax. However, for people who are filing the income tax but is zero income tax, that growth rate has been 15.5. So it is good that compliance has made it to everybody, and a large section of the people are filing the income tax. But does this not also raise a question that has been oft raised about doing away with the personal income tax? If you think about it, the income tax machinery required to collect the personal income tax in a country like India is huge. And the evidence going back as late as last year, the amount of money that one is able to generate from it, I'm presuming, is not the amount of money that one would want to generate in a country as big as India. So I would play the devil's advocate and have your opinion on it. Does an emerging economy like India need the personal income tax?
There are 2-3 countries that have done away with the personal income tax, but the vast majority of countries still do have the personal income tax. Why? That's your question. Why does India need? The reason is that I think if you did away with the personal income tax, the tax incidence would primarily fall on the goods and services tax. Because, in other words, you are moving your tax base from all incomes, which include consumption plus savings, into goods and services, which is just consumption. What it means is that effectively you are excluding savings. And we know that the proportion of savings in income goes up compared to consumption as your income level goes up. As your income level goes down, the proportion of consumption goes up. So, since goods and services tax is primarily on consumption, it is a very regressive tax. It means that as your income declines, you have a higher tax base overall from your household income. And that is why, even though the goods and services tax is easier to collect because it is done at the shops, at the manufacturing, at the traders, and so on in a chain, we can't do away with the personal income tax because of this problem, this dilemma that the goods and services tax is certainly likely to be, in most empirical circumstances, more regressive than the income tax. And therefore, we continue with it. Now, some tax economists have argued and tried to show that goods and services tax is not necessarily more regressive and so on. So, in a particular small, short circumstance, in a short period, maybe that could be true that the goods and services tax also uh, had certain elements, and the personal income tax had a lot of discounted base features. So they both of them was similar in terms of their tax incidence and distribution effect. But in general, that is not true. Therefore, we have to have the personal income tax. And otherwise, if we don't, even though the very rich probably pay very little personal income tax because their incomes are basically in the form of dividends and so on, and in the form of capital gains, and we don't have the same rate of capital gains in India as in income tax. Slowly the capital gains rates are moving towards the income tax rates, which is the correct one. Eventually we should collapse in other words, the capital gains should be embedded into the income tax structure as well. But so far we don't have it. Therefore, I think even the personal income tax needs to be reformed further so that the very rich will pay more tax through improving the structure. But that doesn't mean, and therefore certainly we cannot do away with the personal income tax, because we need to expand the base of the personal income tax to capture the income base of the very rich and take their fair share from them. And in fact, some of the very rich are willing. In my experience, I remember during TARC when we consulted some people that I could trust and so on confidentially, and they said, yes, we are willing to pay if we feel it is fair. But sometimes what happens is that their main complaint was the administration of it, that they are asked to provide trucks of files and without any explanation as to what will be done with them and so on. So those are very important elements, and that's why the TARC report, even though the government has implemented several aspects of it selectively, I think the overall thrust and also many other aspects, selective aspects, still have to be implemented. The main thing being ultimately from the richest to the poorest. No one should say that the tax administration is unfair. You yourself said that kind of feel equal. There should be little inequality, the feeling of inequality in the burden of administration. That is yet to be fully achieved. Even though improvements have been made, it will take time. But it cannot take too much time, because in developed countries, advanced economies, as well as several emerging economies, big strides have been made in terms of identifying the real tax evaders through AI. And such administrations go directly for those kinds of cases rather than calling up small errors and so on, and you appear in front of us, etc. Because similarly, faceless assessment, that was earnestly put forward by the finance minister, but for 2-3 years after that there was severe complaints by even empathetic tax practitioners to the government that faceless assessment was not faceless assessment at all. And if one really looked at the requirements for faceless assessment, which moved so far away from the finance minister's intentions, through the administrative requirement made by the administration, that faceless assessment kind of lost its face. Let me use the term in another way. And so therefore, I think the most important criterion that we have to achieve is an administration in which people have trust and faith from top to bottom, the taxpayers. Then I think still to answer your question, to remain with your question, I think the personal income tax will still be needed for equality, to reduce inequality. but it will also remain very difficult to administer. So I think I agree that personal income, why have the personal income tax? Is difficult to administer. It is more difficult than GST and so on. But the primary focus of taxation is to achieve or promote equality, and we need the personal income tax for that.
Thank you. I think this was I mean, it would really break the heart of everybody who was saying, waiting for you to say, yes, personal income tax will go. But to continue with this, one last question before we move away from personal income taxes, corporate taxes, and beyond. There was an assessment, or rather, a very interesting analytical piece that was published in the Economic Times and Times of India. And it argued for what you just said, the 10, 20, 30% of the tax slabs that are in India. So 10% if you earn a certain amount of money, 20% if you earn a certain amount of money, and 30% if you earn a certain amount of money. The writers showed by comparing it with gold prices that actually the 10, 20, 30% slab has not really kept pace with real income. So
With
with real income, inflation. So, and that kind of led me to wonder, should there not be a mechanism? Because I agree with what you're saying about income tax bringing fairness, but should there not be a mechanism for reassessment of these slabs in the income within which they are being targeted? Because sometimes with inflation and other pressures that are being faced by a taxpayer, they they don't see any merit in the logic of how the tax is being collected. So your comments on that, sir?
Yeah. Here, again, the issue is the bottom line, and then I will give a little explanation, is that does tax chase inflation or does inflation chase tax? What do you mean by that? You have said quite rightly that shouldn't the tax rates and so on be automatically adjusted to inflation? But some economists several years ago showed that the tax rates, when changed, they occur a little before inflation. So it seems that the tax rates are adjusted and then inflation catches up. And then again, tax rates. Rather than inflation has gone up, therefore you adjust the tax rates. So it's a kind of a chicken egg problem, as it is called. But it is true that I also agree, irrespective of that dilemma, we cannot, when overall income, both nominal GDP, nominal incomes, real GDP, and real incomes are going up as per the claim of government itself, by definition, to keep the tax rate as 30% for such elevated incomes over 5 years, government should say that should see that this is untenable as policy in a poor country like ours. And also, there's very good reason for government. And what is the reason? If you look at any comparable country, in my book there are several tables. Actually, rather than that book, there's another book that came out the following year, which I have called Poverty and Inequality in India. It came from Bristol University Press, and there are several cross-country tables where I've shown this point in different ways, that our tax rates are very low. In this tax book also, the one that you are citing, also there are several tables showing that our Indian rates are very low. And at a time when there was a talk about a discussion about tax rates being marginally higher, some people, stalwarts from different groups, they said, we are going to, the date happens, I'm going to go away to Singapore, I'm going to this. I said that, okay, anyone is free in India to go anywhere. But Singapore rates, personal income tax rates are not low at all. And therefore, I feel that lots of changes, improvements have to be made in India with inheritance tax, which are all direct taxes. Not, I'm not speaking about GST anymore. Inheritance tax, wealth tax, capital gains tax, integration with the income tax, and the income tax structure by improving the structure beyond 30%. And so, if a person has an income of let's say several 10 crores, a little bit extra of a super rich tax is just not enough. It should be taxed at the whole thing at a progressive rate. The marginal amount should be 40-45%. That's a minimum, and any comparable countries like that. So I think that that is fueling income inequality in the country. And whoever might, I mean, those who are benefiting, even they should step up and say, we will pay more. Look at the things in taxation history, what our country did. Huge careers in law, barristers, das, you from South, Kalki, this, that, you name it. People giving up their careers and wearing khadi and walking out with Mahatma Gandhi. Subhash Chandra Bose dropping out of top rank in ICS, Indian Civil Service, leaving and walking out and coming and joining the Congress. I mean, that kind of sacrifice, I'm not calling for that. I think we are not in that category anymore. Neither do we have to be, because those things come in a spark, in the sunlight, and, but people should be willing to pay. And there I feel, without actually getting rid of personal income tax, there I'm afraid, Professor, it's difficult for me to agree. In fact, for the upper income groups, because of our rising inequality, we must increase the rates and integrate all kinds of sources of income into that structure.
Thank you, sir. We are just about to hit the hour mark. As this conversation now has to kind of get to its summation. So my last two questions, and still a lot of ground to cover. But your book from 2021 was just one of the many things I read. I also read a think piece that you wrote for the Asian Development Bank. And you make a very interesting argument there about, should we tax the robots? I would now connect two things that I wanted to ask you for some time. The corporations. In your work, be it at the IMF, be it at the MHRC, how do we tax the corporates has been one of the things that you've been advocating for and you've been giving out advice on. But today, the corporate is a very distributed entity with one arm here, one leg there, source and capital flowing from one part of the world to another. All of this makes for a very complicated setup, now made more complicated by the introduction of the AI and what you call the robotic processes. How do we make sense of such a complicated thing? And how do we elicit the maximum tax without hurting the investments? Because this is the question that I think more and more countries are going to face. We have examples of Ireland and we have examples of Malta, where these are tax shelters in a way, where a lot of these companies are headquartered, but they are not giving any benefit to the local economy. And in turn, the local people, the citizens of these countries are now questioning whether they have any benefit from so-called such large corporations being housed there. So how do the political leaders navigate this complicated and very volatile situation?
One, excellent, Professor. One is, you are talking about artificial intelligence and how do corporates go about it? And the second is the issue of, the second is related. What's the second issue that you raised just now?
So the second issue is, every country wants their country to be the investment hotspot.
Yeah, how do you? Now the thing is, we cannot stop AI. And we shouldn't, because that's the way humankind has progressed, and we shouldn't. However, what I wrote in that governance brief for the Asian Development Bank was that uh, AI is bound to replace labor. In fact, AI will replace blue collar and that level of labor much more rapidly than white collar labor that may have to work with AI in conducting AI in, in a complementary basis, probably. But blue collar labor certainly is substitutable and will be substituted. Therefore, my question was, in where do the resources come from to absorb this vast pools of labor that will come out of thing? And I found that in South Korea, this has happened because South Korea is the most artificial intelligence robotic economy in the world today. And they found that their unemployment had hit more than 12-13%, which was unheard of in their economy. And so they took out some tax rebates that were being given for AI. And they found as a result that unemployment had fallen. So, however, if you look at the same vicinity in Japan, Thailand, and other comparable countries, they have huge incentives for AI. So, my conclusion was that South Korea had already reached this high unemployment level that they became concerned about and took some measures. Therefore, there has to be probably some international convention or regional groupings, let's say Asian Development Bank, anywhere, IMF, etc., where some commonality has to be wrought, has to be agreed to and constructed. And we need to, because otherwise what will happen is that individual countries will take unilateral decisions and take, okay, you spend another 4% of your revenue on CSR, corporate social responsibility, and so on and so forth. And no one will know what that CSR is. Each country will define differently. But if possible, we need some international protocol. And that is the only way the corporates, which are all disparate, will come together. And many corporates say that they are already doing this, and when they are called, they say we are already doing that. That shows that they are willing. But many of the authorities in advanced economies and leave alone emerging economies, they really don't know what these corporates are doing. But within the OECD, the corporates are being asked to reveal their expenditure patterns, etc., which has also started. Among the very rich corporates, they are already revealing and reporting to the OECD their plans, their expenditures, so one can see what they are spending on AI, have any compensatory policies, retraining policies, and so on. So you are absolutely right that I feel, and I've expressed in that governance brief, that it is very important to get the corporates together and get them to spend on it. But I specifically believe that now moving from income tax and corporate income tax or personal income tax, I believe, considering all tax possibilities, that at this stage it is better and easier and achievable to impose excises, selective excises on instruments of AI. Without killing AI, AI should contribute in the form of excise taxes. And depending on the advancements of these sectors, the rates can be imposed. And for that, the best would be to have an international convention. It is not easy. And what I've pointed out there is that, not artificial intelligence is one step ahead, but even for digital economy, to come to a common base for digital taxation has been almost impossible. And a major bottleneck has been the United States, because the headquarters of many of the digital companies are in the US. And because countries like Turkey, France, UK, India started imposing digital taxation because of lack of international agreements, the US is actually, the US Trade Representative's Office, USTR, they have taken all these countries to court. I mean, to saying that they are operating against the unique interests of U.S. companies that are headquarters in the U.S. So it's very difficult to come to agreement, even among friendly economies, on these kinds of very advanced international economic and international tax positions. And given the difficulties in digital taxation, I have argued that it is all the more important to think about what to do in the case of artificial intelligence. Both reduced tax rebates, no countries don't want to hear about it at the moment, but start discussing it, and not only reduce tax rebates, you really have to tax them selectively on the as excise taxes with a common understanding across nations. And these can be done, by the way, because if you really look at international tax movements, uh, 3 decades ago, there was hardly any agreement. Today, if you see the BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting of the OECD's project, then you see a lot of agreement among.
Right, sir. That is actually one of the things that I found very interesting because you connected to very emerging themes, but you also then kind of place the onus on mutual agreements and not the favored methods of the USTR, writing a
Mm,
report citing people or countries that are against the interests of the United States and going to the cases. Last question, sir. And this is also slightly a jointed question because I really felt that this needs to be addressed. Over the last decade, we've heard about different papers, Panama Papers, this and other places where a lot of tax shelters and people and companies that have invested in these tax havens or money that is being moved. In fact, Tom Burgess has a very interesting book called Kleptopia. So, we are looking at a lot more agreement globally about the fairer and nature of tax to be divided amongst the global elites or global countries. But on the other hand, we are looking at the nature of certain tax havens changing. But there is also now an emerging way that tax shelters are being set up. They're becoming more and more complicated. So where is that agreement which kind of makes for tax shelters to be more open and transparent? They could still be a tax shelter because I suppose there is some incentive to be there, but they should be open and transparent so that the money is not used for, say, promoting terrorism or to be a place for where proceeds of ill gains can be stored over a longer period of time. Because in the end, this is not money that can do good in any way, shape, or form. Because from tax shelters, you can only have what is called as whitewashing and different kind of washing that is happening. I wanted your comment on it because tax law is getting fairer and is becoming open. Tax shelters are getting more opaque and they're getting more closed in. So, how do we tackle this?
Yeah. Uh, Even before one thinks of whitewash and terrorism, finance, and so on and so forth, the fact remains that to begin with, the tax shelters were created by advanced economies. And today, the main tax shelters, I mean, apart from Liechtenstein and Switzerland and so on, under the shelters of the US and the UK, unfortunately. So while they propel the base erosion and profit shifting projects in the auspices of OECD, but on the other hand, they are sitting and protecting a lot of tax shelters in their own territories. They are in their dominions, in arrangements that they have with small islands and so on. And what do they mean? They mean that the very rich in their countries can have an escape route from paying tax. And the EU, European Union, started a movement where, among the European Union countries, they began to list tax heavily tax sheltered countries. One was a grey list and one was a black list. And it is happenstance, I guess, but noteworthy that UK was not in the grey list, but there were some rumors that it might get into the grey list, and it seems like a coincidence that just about that time that Britain left the EU. So what propels what is very difficult to say, but it seems like there are these very tacit connections that underlie all these many of these economies. That doesn't mean that the China won't also use tax shelters if it needs to, and so on and so forth. But the point is that standards are laid down where the ability to come to honest international arrangements in taxation uh, is very, very thin. And unless the major countries take a lead, and then you get into many complexities, because in democracies, elections are funded, and therefore who gets sheltered, and so on and so forth. And you get into a very, very complex world. So it is very difficult to say, can tax shelters be addressed and contained? I don't know whether they can be. I think they should be. And if the world, the most advanced economies, believe in that, and there are people who are like-minded, who think like that, then I think if they think that it should be, then some positive steps can be taken in that direction. But often you see that if the individual interests are affected, like I said, in the case of the IT industry, digital taxation, and so on, and then immediate steps are taken to block it out. And that in that instance, it is very difficult to contain tax shelters. It is very difficult to get digital taxation going, because the whole economy escapes, and you get these, multi-billionaires, which is great, but they have to pay their due shares. But if they are not asked to pay their shares, then why would they? And now artificial intelligence and so on. So tax shelters are a must, but we have to struggle and we have to push ahead, I suppose. That's all I can say at the moment. Tax shelters are discussed. Very brilliant papers have been written, and I think there's some research going on in the University of California at San Diego, and but the ability, and there are counter arguments, like it seems that the announcements or revelation of tax shelters seem to come out at very crucial moments that are helpful to the media that bring this information out. So how they are, they have this, they're sitting on this information, but they bring it out at certain points. So then you get into a battle as to what is the motivation of these media channels, very important, powerful media channels, to bring out certain news at certain points in time. Who is it against, and so on. Right. So let us rest at that point. It's a very, very murky area as yet.
Right. This was my last question, but just one thing occurred to me. Politicians across the world, and you've worked with different finance ministers, over 30 finance ministers all across the world in different capacities. What motivates the finance ministers or bureaucrats to levy retrospective taxes? It's a very interesting area, because just about every other finance minister suddenly wakes up and they say, "Oh, this area is something that we should have taxed, but we forgot to tax." So, do you think these decisions, not a policy continuation and not continuing on a particular path, from a regulatory point of view, helps in creation of these tax shelters?
No, I think tax shelters are one thing, and retrospective taxation is one thing. Now, taxpayers have taken advantage of tax shelters on an honest basis and expectation. Therefore, retrospective taxation has no role to correct tax shelters. tax shelters should be corrected going forward. So let us take steps to stop tax shelters even now. We don't have to wait until we pass a retrospective amendment. In fact, I think retrospective amendments are very detrimental to psychology, productivity, and the health of the productive sector. It has done a lot of harm. I mean, we've seen Vodafone case and Supreme Court giving one direction, the next Supreme Court giving another direction. Therefore, I think we should have a general law completely eliminating retrospective taxation, except where the an error has been made very clearly in the explanation of the law. Certain advanced economies like Sweden, they have made it very clear. Not all advanced economies, by the way, are completely devoid of retrospective taxation. But in such countries, you can see that there are very few and far between, and the intention is really to help the taxpayer. Now, in emerging economies, are we so confident that that would happen? And the much better and safer option is to eliminate retrospective taxation, and that would take off the pressure from the administration to spend huge amounts of administrative resources in international courts to pursue retrospective taxation, knowing that foreign sources have much more resources available to pursue these matters to their in favor of themselves. So I think that we should simply remove, and I think this government has sort of moved in that direction, and they should move completely and say, they have said we will not pursue. No, now they should say we have completely abolished retrospective taxation, except in cases where there are errors that are impinging upon the productivity of the productive sector, and be absolutely sure that the tax administration cannot use that error clause as, kind of using retrospective taxation. It is a very, very pernicious instrument that governments should not utilize.
Right. Absolutely. So it has been an hour and 15 minutes of what was very enlightening conversation for me. And I hope it was not too vague for you to, to have participated in it. But thank you so much for your time. Thank you, sir. Thank you for doing it. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sarai. Thank you.